Several years ago now, back in April of 2009 if I recall correctly, I had just gotten through winter quarter, the first time I went to college, and was taking some advantage of spring break. I, along with 3 friends, decided to get outdoors as it was the first truly nice day of the year. So, I live in western Washington, and there's a stretch of road that hugs the edge of Bellingham Bay and Samish Bay, north of Puget Sound. It is called Chuckanut Drive, and it's a cool stretch of road to drive as it hugs a cliff face for a while and overlooks the water. Along the way, there are a number of turnoffs to get a picture and other touristy stuff. My friends and I drove up there and pulled into one such turnoff with the intention of hiking down to the water, enjoying some lunch, beer, and just enjoying the day. Now, the trail we took bottomed out next to a set of train tracks that hug the coastline like the highway above it. This is a relevant detail here as many transients and other assorted weirdos traveled its length quite often. In fact, we sat on some driftwood on the other side of the tracks next to the bay and watched several go by as we hung out. No one bothered us, and we didn't bother them. But half of them were completely dressed, and things like blankets and even tarps were a common sight to see draped over them. We were there maybe an hour or so before realizing that the place was actually way more boring than we thought it would be and decided to head out and find something else to do. As we were leaving, we spotted what looked like a far better path back up than the one we came down on, and chose it instead. And it was where our day took a bit of a turn. Not long after we started hiking up this new trail, we all saw what was obviously a blanket or something wrapped around something else. It was easily enough to see that it was covering something big and solid, but not as big as a full-grown human. But we knew instantly it was a body. To this day, I can clearly recall how I kept chanting in my own head, "Don't be a child. Don't be a child. Don't be a child." Walking up to it, we saw that it was not a dead kid, which I am so grateful for to this day, but it was so sadly a dead dog. Its head was missing, having been cut clean off at some point just above the collar, which it was still wearing. There was absolutely no blood, and the blanket was still very clean, as though it had just been pulled from the linen closet moments prior. There was no smell from the body either, so I guess it hadn't been there very long. Furthermore, branches and shrubbery had been cut or pulled free and set up in a way to attempt to hide the body from the tracks, which were maybe 10 to 15 feet away from our location. It was obviously a body dump. Somebody had murdered this poor dog and dumped the body by the railroad tracks, and they had done it very recently. At this point, we looked at each other, decided to get out of there, and raced up the steep trail back to the road. We reached my buddy's Blazer and burned rubber at the place as quickly as we could. We later called the sheriff's office about this, but I think they just assumed that a stray dog got hit by a passing train. When we mentioned that its head was missing, we never heard back from them about anything, so I have to assume that either they didn't find it or didn't look. Regardless, I haven't gone back down that stretch of road since. About 9 months ago, my partner and I had just bought a new 6-month-old boxer dog to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company. We decided it would be a good idea to take them for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northeast England, and decided to go for the walk in a rural area north of the River Humber that ran through to the sea. Upon getting to a village close to a local landmark, a World War II Army fort, we decided to walk close by and through the small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass bunker toward the forest, and suddenly, my partner pointed out 2 young men who had begun walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner, as if they were trying to cut us off from nearby. I wondered if the young men were attending some sort of World War II reenactment, as they were both wearing camouflage pants and were also covered in dust and dirt. I thought nothing of them both as I was sure that they would pass us by, but as they grew closer, it appeared they were aiming to walk towards us. They were at least 10 feet away when they stopped, and one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me to this day, as he seemed to have a disregard for manners or even trying to make sense. The young man wanted to know where we were planning on walking, and we told him we were not really sure and would just see where we ended up. The young man looked disappointed by this and suggested we take his route, which went through the forest to what he described as a great place to sightsee and sit, as there were benches to sit down. While the young man was telling us about this, the other boy kept watch of our two dogs almost constantly, as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight at all times. We didn't have much knowledge of this area and had not seen any other dog walkers, so we took the young man's advice too after they pointed to an opening in the woods. So we walked on. The woods cast out about 30% of the sunlight, and as I looked back, I saw that the young man had not walked off, but was watching us walk into the forest. The track looked as though it was man-made, as it seemed to be the only walkable area throughout that forest. About 2 minutes into the trek, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bush, which at first we thought nothing of, as both dogs sniff everywhere that they can when we walk them. However, she began sniffing in one spot and rolling on the floor. We went over to her, and Sasha began sniffing some sort of shattered rubber pig mask with brown-red liquid on it. It looked disgusting, and my partner forced the dog away from it, as it looked as though flies were crawling all around it. Further into the walk, the woods had turned into a long path of trees and bushes that became very narrow, but we could see a turn far ahead, and we agreed that if it led nowhere, we would turn back. I walked ahead and saw my phone, preparing to take a photo of the woods. So when I felt several small pricks in my neck, chin, and part of my face, I let out a gasp to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still in an alarmed way, followed by him carefully removing thin pieces of string away from my face. As it turned out, someone had tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree in the walkway. It's safe to say that we were both terrified, confused, and angry after this point, and hurried back to the car and left back to home. I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but as we drove off, I swear I could see something through the back mirror peeking out onto the road. So this is different from the usual stories, but I think it applies. A while back, me and several friends all decided to go camping, which was an excuse for all of us to drink for several days. I had to work during the day, so everything was set up by the time I got there around 9:00 p.m. and started heavily drinking to catch up. After a few hours, we started to run out of firewood and had a competition to see who could get the most. I headed off away from the group and found some leftover logs. Back at the site, there was nobody there, so I started splitting the wood with an axe and having a good time. All of a sudden, a young couple came out of the tent with the most horrified expression I had ever seen. This is when it hits me. I was at the wrong campsite. From their perspective, that must have been terrifying, seeing a random stranger laughing while swinging an axe around at their campsite. I apologized and quickly got out of there. My family has some property that backs up to Carson National Forest in New Mexico. It's been in the family for years, and my sister and I both spent our summers up there. It's gorgeous. Well, it is for people who lived out in far west Texas. Nice and green, cool mountain air in the summer. It was always a relief to get up there and away from the dusty ranch. My dad was ex-military, and having 2 daughters, let's just say we did lots of outdoor stuff. He taught us survival skills and how to defend ourselves. We hunted and fished and did lots of camping and hiking. To us, it was always a fun time, but I guess he felt the need to pass on his skills to us. We spent several weeks in the summer up there, hiking with him, and exploring the old cabins, mining communities, and checking the big ditch project that was built for the Red River back in the late 1800s. I think that's the correct date for that project, but I'm not sure. Anyways, it's a great place to hike with some beautiful high mountain lakes, streams, and lots of wildlife. This happened when I was in college and my younger sister was still in high school. My dad was still at home, having to work, would come up every few weeks to spend time with us. We were up there with her mom, and she mainly spent time in town or around the property painting. We spent our time on the Jeep trails or hiking and sleeping. It was late June, maybe early July, I think, and we had decided we were going to hike up to Lost Lake. It's one of my favorite lakes up there, because if you look at it from a certain angle, it looks like a heart. We set off in the morning and were prepared. We both had a small pack, our water, some snacks. We both had a small hammock we planned to set up once we got to the lake, so we could just enjoy the area for a while. I will admit to being an outdoor type, and swear when it's quiet enough you can hear the trees talk. We also both always carried a knife when we hiked. My dad always insisted we have something just in case an accident happened, or we just needed it. Hiking was going good, since the summer cabin is pretty far up the valley. We just set out on foot to the trailhead to get to Lost Lake. You take another trail that goes up to Middle Fork Lake, then you break off that trail for Lost Lake. We ran into a few other hikers, but they were going to Middle Fork Lake, and we were pleased because it looked like we could possibly have Lost Lake all to ourselves. It's a pretty good lake with some long switchbacks at the end, but totally worth it because the lake is just beautiful and a very pretty emerald green in color. We got there and saw that we did have the lake to ourselves. We hiked around the lake and decided to hike back a bit and to find a good spot to set up our hammocks. We walked into the tree line, and the first thing my sister said was, "Do you smell that?" Yep, I did. It was a dead animal with the strong scent of blood. We had both done lots of hunting and knew that smell, and that's when I saw it. It was a deer carcass, but what was around it was what disgusted me. Placed around the deer carcass in a circle were its organs and trails, etc. But it wasn't like it was being cleaned. It's like they were placed in a certain arrangement with little piles of rocks in between everything. Now, I know how some people get disgusting with their kills, and I've had some guys try to gross me out, but fall for crap like that. But this made me uneasy. It wasn't just being cleaned. It was like it was set up in a certain meaning, or it had meaning. I stepped back from this weird circle, and then my sister starts to say my name but stops because then we see the guy who had done this. And he looks like he just climbed out from inside the deer because he is covered in blood and doesn't have much clothing on. At first, I thought he didn't have anything on, but honestly, I didn't try to check him out much. He was standing back away from his gruesome little circle, just standing close to a group of trees that were pretty close together. It was maybe 20 feet from us. I think he was maybe trying to hide. Not for sure, but my dad had always taught us that if we ever found ourselves in a situation where we didn't feel in control, to do everything in our power to try to take control of the situation. Do something that is going to take the other person by surprise. Don't do what they expect you to do. So this is raging through my brain. And I also could tell my sister was about to freak out. So I stepped up and said, "Hey, pretty good kill you got there. Use a bow." The guy just stood there, his eyes all crazy wide, like he was stoked out of his brain on planet Pluto. So I'm thinking, great, we ran into a guy getting his hunt on, and he had lost it, and was getting blood crazy with his deer. He was staring me down, and I was staring right back when my sister was getting ready to run. I still don't know what came over me, but then I put my hand on my knife that I kept on my waist, just to show him I wasn't completely helpless. I don't know why I did it, but something told me to let him know that I wasn't going to back down or be afraid. I kept eye contact with him. I would guess he was maybe in his early 30s, but I am bad at guessing people's ages. He was pretty dirty though. He could tell that even with all the blood he had everywhere. I started to back off, and my sister had moved behind me. So I spoke again and said, "So, you having a great hunting day?" Again, the crazy didn't say a thing, just stood there like he was a statue or something, or like he thought I couldn't see him if he didn't move or make a sound. We moved back to the lakeside again and booked it around the lake. My sister stayed up front, and she was shaking pretty bad. I was mainly angry at first because he wanted to get all crazy in the woods with his deer, and he should have gone further back up the forest. We get back to the trailhead and stopped to get our bearings and looked at each other. I was scanning the forest line to make sure we weren't being followed, and my sister was just in shock. We started down the trail pretty fast, and I was hoping I could keep my sister together until we could at least reach the Middle Fork Lake Trail, or that we could even run into some more hikers. But the odds weren't good on this particular trail because you have to get an early start on the Lost Lake Trail, and by now it was late morning, almost noon. We were making good time and hadn't discussed what we saw, just started hiking back down. I started to get that feeling, when you want to look alone. I kept checking but didn't see anything or even hear anything. At first, my sister refused to look back and just kept going, but I felt that I had to keep checking to make sure the idiot wasn't following us. That's when the first stuff came flying at us. It was some small pebbles, but it really made me angry because it was obvious someone was throwing them at us, and it could have only been him. My sister was almost running at this point, but I am the mouthy smart aleck. I blame the Texas upbringing. And darn it, this was my forest. I'd grown up here. And these were my lakes, my trails, and I wasn't about to let some crazy dude ruin it for me. I started yelling back that he needed to go back to his deer and leave us alone. At this point, my sister is telling me to shut up and just come on. And I'm thinking, no way. This guy is just trying to scare us. The pebbles stopped, and then we started hearing barking and growling noises. My sister said, and he's growling at us, and I just told her to get on down the trail and ignore it. He was behind us pretty much the whole way, growling and making these barking noises every once in a while, but we never caught a glimpse of him. Hence, when we got close to where the trail joined in with the Middle Fork Trail, he seemed to back off. I never caught sight of him behind us, but I could hear him, and I just knew he was there. We started down the rest of the trail. My sister refused to stop or look behind her, so I kept checking every so often. I didn't see anything more or hear anything. We started to discuss what had happened, and she felt like he was very sinister and felt like we had been in a dangerous situation. I felt like he was just getting his kicks out of scaring two girls. I mean, he had to have heard us coming around the lake. We weren't being quiet. It was the opposite because there are black bears up there, and we would always be pretty loud while hiking, hoping to scare off any bear in the area so we wouldn't come up on one. To this day, she still thinks he was sinister, and I think he was just trying to scare two girls and was getting his kicks out of it. We told her parents, and my dad didn't like what he had heard. He did teach us some more up-close defense skills after that day, and forbade us from ever hiking alone, or just the two of us again. We didn't hike up that trail for several years with anyone that freaked my sister out, and I just didn't like remembering a time I was scared in the forest that I considered my own. I didn't know it at the time, but after we had gotten back to the house and told my mom, she had called some neighbors, and a few of the men hiked up there the next day to check things out. They did find the deer carcass and some empty hiking packs like what day hikers use, but they were empty. They also found a rustic campsite further back in the woods that had been cleared out as well. No sign of the weirdo. Last year, I was hiking in Shenandoah, Virginia. It was a planned day hiking trip with myself and two friends. Late into the first day, one of my friends grew ill and decided to turn back. The second friend joined him just in case it got worse. They told me to go on, and seeing as I'd been looking forward to the trip, I did. As evening approached, I came upon a clearing into the forest. On a table surrounded by tools and several cans of spray paint was an elaborate dollhouse. It was large, perhaps 3 feet tall, and its walls and windows were open as if it had just been built and was drying. That lingering smell of spray paint still hung in the air around it. On the back of the house, a photo had been affixed. It was a family picture, perhaps taken in the 80s. Everyone in the picture looked very uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be taking the picture or were forced to, not scared. just very uncomfortable. I left it and continued on so that I might reach my planned campsite by nightfall. The wind had picked up considerably, and in the distance, I heard a branch give and fall, crashing to the forest floor, startling me. I found my campsite, but was a bit unnerved by the dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I realized I didn't want to camp out in the open, and where whoever was working on it might stumble upon me. I had one of those little one-person tents that stand just tall enough for a person to lay down in. I set it up behind a thick stand of brush, one side blocked off by a tall stand of rocks. I was glad for this because not only was I now hidden, but the rocks effectively blocked the heavy winds, which had now turned cold as the frigid air tumbled down from the mountains. At night, the sound of the wind through the forest was relaxing, and I think I fell asleep right away. Have you ever been awoken by a loud sound, and you're unsure what it is exactly, but some remnants of it echo in your mind for a moment after waking? That's what happened to me sometime later in the pitch dark. I had the sensation that someone was near. I listened intently, trying to hear over the wind. I heard a man's voice somewhere in the distance, harsh, rapid, then becoming softer. It was too far away from me to discern what he was saying, but close enough that I could hear inflection and cadence that sounded like a crazy person scolding himself. Then his voice became softer, answering. As I listened, his voice grew louder and louder, and I could hear his clumsy footfalls crashing towards me. He walked by where I was camped, just several feet away from the brush that concealed me. By now, my eyes had adapted somewhat to the pale moonlight, but I still couldn't make out anything more than a large, massive shape. He was probably about 6'6", heavily built. He was carrying something long beneath his arm, a rolled-up tent, I guessed. He was angrily talking about someone's face and how it haunted him. His voice then became childlike, and his conversation with himself turned to the topic of cheese and crackers. The dude was clearly off his rocker. After a moment, he continued on, his voice receding until I could no longer hear him. I slept little that night. At first light, I booked it back the way I came, back to town, and I noted that the dollhouse was not in the clearing when I passed back by. I'm a 33-year-old female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for a few days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook, which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, and I am on retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers on web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only used free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week, we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us is involved with social media and know very little about different programs like Instagram or using the apps. Last summer, we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscapes, and it does. The rules of this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit, and there were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul. But on one day, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about half a mile out, we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage. so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy. Others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and just building relationships. Around 30 yards away from the tent, there was zip closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered. So we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped, never heard a peep. They moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about green tent guy until nearing the end of the day. 5 on our trek back, we were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up to the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was opened, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying it's weird, and maybe someone is hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we've heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me that we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some smokable to keep the peace, and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns and says to me, "If we find a body." My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I have never seen a body before and don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe, legs, all 4 of them, covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was lying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the orifices were covered in dried blood and a gape like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down in the scary, broken-looking angle. The tent was opened, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we could have anyway, because at this point, the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil, and a stained green and white fringe kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All my boyfriend could muster was, "What in God's name?" And we turned and ran. We ran into the trail and dropped down for as far as we could until dusk was fully on us, and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail, and neither of us left. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that at any moment, this dead deer-having man would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, know where we were, and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way back out of the park to report what we had just seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. We asked if he knew how the deer was killed, and at that point, we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound. But we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and had never approached another unmanned tent again. This happened about 6 years ago. I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on a second deployment if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army's Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that. And by then was an active duty Special Forces engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to mess around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness. For those unfamiliar with the area, before he left for 9 months, the trip began smoothly. Up until the third night, we were camping out around 8 p.m. We had our camp set up, eating dinner, and were sitting by the fire, talking about typical boy crap like guns and girls. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill, adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This is summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so, even though they were relatively polite. My brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. I've been getting closer for the past hour, so just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to crap my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hawks. They use dogs to pin them down and then shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to calm me down. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours. Around 2:00 a.m., I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters. When I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick, and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said. As soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rocking with God knows how much weight in the Army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and a stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up the hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. And remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was. When I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking, I looked over, and my brother had his pistol, an HK-USP that he gave to me a few years after the story took place, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed to the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or some minutes and reached it. There were 5 of them and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers and campers, nobody who comes up on a random campsite in the middle with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared out of my mind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics. Either they lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around, and talking to themselves. My brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards us, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back, because he taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight, and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later the red filter helps preserve night vision, and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline, and what I think was now confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a little while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where are y'all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, because of our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. A shot, maybe 5 or 6 more times, and then started walking back the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family had for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent our Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. And the Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. And we saw the game warden truck. My brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our stuff, and waited by the pack for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked them not to do that, because I thought they might never let me go camping again. So this happened a few years ago. I believe it was a summer going into my junior year of high school. I had been going to sleepover camps since I was very young, and that summer was no exception. However, I was in a different option of camp this year, where I would be hiking the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks, as opposed to staying on the campgrounds. This was a new experience for me, but I was very excited because I'm an adventurous person. So on this trip, it was me, the 2 female counselors, and 9 other girls. This happened a few days after our trip began, so we were still getting to know each other a little more, but we were also pretty comfortable around each other. We stopped for lunch around this water fountain. Our spot was on the trail, but just happened to be by a portion of the trail where a road went through. While we were eating, we all noticed one of those stereotypical creeper vans driving back and forth in the same portion of the road. None of us really said anything, but we all noticed it. After about 5 minutes of this van driving back and forth, it pulled onto the trail close to where we were eating. It just sat there. I guess we all figured the driver was lost, or was looking for a bathroom, because none of us said anything about it. Finally, a man got out of the car, ran up to us, and started screaming. Does anyone know CPR? My half-brother has the shakes. Immediately, our 2 counselors got up and ran to his van, and they were gone for a few minutes. We started getting suspicious. People began saying, I could have sworn I saw his van drive by a few times. And, if it was an emergency, why would he take the time to say, half-brother? Our counselors finally came back with these blank looks on their face. We began asking them a bunch of questions, but they wouldn't talk. This man walked up to us with these weird puppet things. He was one of those plastic statues people put on their porch for Halloween. Only there was no bowl full of candy. He began asking us questions, but no one answered. We just kept eating our lunch in silence. In a creepy way, he said, "My puppet likes girls." He also told us his puppet could talk and pressed the button on its foot. I guess he got the hint because he went back to his car and sat there for what seemed to be an eternity. He just sat there with his door open, blasting music. Eventually, he left, and we quickly packed up our bags and booked it out of there. No, it wasn't outright scary, but it was just the first part of some very strange occurrences on that day. We continued our hike down the Appalachian Trail. We talked about the creepy man we encountered for a while, and then began sharing scary stories until we reached our campsite. Once we reached the campsite, we set up our tents and were just hanging out. We reached the campsite pretty early that day, so there was plenty of daylight left. Being a group of teenage girls, we got bored easily and began walking around the campsite. We flirted with a group of boys until they got bored of us and eventually left. Then we decided to play a game called Elephants and Gazelles, and the premise of the game is unimportant, but it is best played with a large group of people. It just so happens that 3 guys walked over to our group to introduce themselves, not the guys we previously were flirting with. Since they came over and seemed friendly, one of the girls in the group decided to invite them to play. And this is when things got weird. During breaks in the game, people would share personal stories and just get to know each other more, even us girls who had been talking nonstop for a few days. Out of nowhere, one of the guys reveals that 2 of them are trans. Let me put it out there that I have absolutely no problem with people changing their genders and believe people have the right to openly be who they are. But I just had to put that out there because I think it's weird. Not that they are trans, just that it came out of nowhere. They then began to talk about how they are trying to start their own reality show about 3 trans men who live in New York, and the 3rd member of their group, who is not trans, will just pretend to be on the show. Again, I just thought it was weird that they'd brought it up out of nowhere. I just found it kind of strange, especially since we barely knew them. Later in the game, I guess they were talking amongst themselves and start laughing loudly, and one shouts, "That's funny because your dad is in jail." I think everyone is just getting kind of uncomfortable at this point. To break the ice, I suppose, one of the girls begins telling them the story of the creepy puppet man we encountered earlier in the day. They start laughing and tell us it's their uncle who dropped them off earlier in the day. Eventually, they said they were tired and were returning to the tent for the evening. We were all relieved and went on with whatever it was we did. Later, when a few girls went to the bathroom, they walked past their tent on the way to the bathroom. They said that they heard them singing Justin Timberlake songs, and on the way back, they heard one of the guys yell, "Tickle fight." It rained very hard that night. The next morning, we woke up, and their tent was nowhere in sight. We were very surprised because we typically got up around sunrise. Right before we left the campsite, I saw a piece of paper folded up on a stump near our tent. It read, "We got rained on and peed our pants, and we will miss all of you, the great friendships we had. The creepy guys who get no respect." I guess I just don't know what was worse, the fact that they were just weird and told us all of those things for no reason, or that they were related to that creepy puppet guy. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on a great American road trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke, and as my mom had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested that to save a ton of money, we should sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut one of them up to make curtains. By the end of the first week, we'd gotten so we could set up camp in about 10 minutes. Luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free campsites, rest areas, basically anywhere it seemed safe and semi-legal. There was never a night, after the first night, where we felt scared until the last week of the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go on our set schedule and would never drive more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination really in mind outside of a few must-see landmarks. We'd drive to a few places we found the night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks we met at a campsite, met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar, played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm, got fed breakfast and dinner by a ton of campers who invited us to hang out with them, and spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods, following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off. When we pulled up to the campsite, there was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened the door. Tez waved hello, and he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if she hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again, staring at us the entire time. Figuring he just wanted some privacy and thought we'd be obnoxious, we pulled further down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while it was still light out, we goofed around for a while, smoking, laughing, and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tez pointed out a campfire further down the campsites, and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks by just going up and offering beer or just chatting, so we wandered over near the campfire. There were 2 men, the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly, and we sat down to chat with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out that the 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on something. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs. However, he seemed harmless. This left us chatting with a younger man who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting about our trip, families, and everything. Then he started talking about the bear he'd seen, a bear, earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wasn't unheard of for one of us to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laughs, or for him to nudge Tez with his elbow. Jokes on the foreigner and the city girl, right? It never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed as well and joked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved on to another subject, but within 5 minutes, the ranger had come back to it and was talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how we tried to steer the conversation away from the idea of serial killers, he kept latching back on. The older man was high as a kite at this point and was staring at the stars, not talking. We just awkwardly laughed, sipped our beer, and tried to get the conversation going somewhere else. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point, it was pitch black out, and I couldn't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside of that circle. Suddenly, there is a red dot in the darkness, and it took a moment for me to realize that it's a camera the ranger is holding. A camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't odd for people we met to ask to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous, dark hair, blue eyes, like a young Megan Fox, and we were friendly. People like having pictures of themselves. It was an entirely strange thing to have this person taking a photo of us without asking or even indicating that that's what he was doing. We're both staring at him like deer in the headlights at this point, but instead of realizing what he was doing is a bit weird, he checks his camera, adjusts some things, and takes another photo, this time with the flash, not asking us to smile, not proposing a group photo, and no explanation. After this photo, he comes back to the fire and sits down, and no words are said about the photo. At this point, me and Tez are mutually freaked out. We make up some excuse that we need to go set up our campsite and break out of there, and we stand to leave. The UFO guy smiles and says to have a good night. The ranger, however, looks at us with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes and says, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. That wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV and jumping in the front seats. My friend Tez is all but hyperventilating. Why did he take pictures of us? I was shaking, and I responded. I read that serial killers sometimes warn their victims. She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. Do you think he just took victim photos of us? We're both freaked out. She's in a full panic and turns the headlights on in the car. I immediately yell at her to turn them off because now he knows exactly where our car is. God knows why. But that is the only night we'd not set up camp. We didn't need to tear anything down. So we just put the car in drive and floored it out of the campsite. As we got onto the dirt road, that ranger was walking towards our car with that same cold expression. Summer '97. I was 9 and scared of my own shadow, so this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mom and I drove up from Revere, Massachusetts, to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had work. Everything was going normal at the campsite. We set up the tent, built our fire. All was well. It was still daylight when we noticed that the lone, greasy-haired man in the campsite connected to ours was continually running and leaping onto a wood post, then attempting to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over and over. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely cook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mom thought maybe he was trying out for the circus. Cut to nighttime. Absolute darkness except for the campfire. My mom and I were sitting and roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our site. He was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mom was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed. "Hey," he mumbled. "I need your help from my campsite." We waited, and he didn't go on. My mom asked what he needed help with. The filthy man said, "I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over help me." He then looked at me and said, "Don't worry, kid, you can stay here with your fire." I remember getting goosebumps at that. My mom said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys. You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere," suggested the man. My mom told him she didn't. The ghoulish man wouldn't let up though. "Yeah, you must have a hanger lying around here somewhere. Maybe you dropped one on the ground near your tent." My mom adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger and quickly added, "My husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy." "Yeah, all right." The creep slurred, and he started to charge away into the dark. But he turned his head and said, "Well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here." And with that, this terrible man left. My mom and I barely slept that night. I found her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through the long night, worrying a butcher knife was going to slash through the tent wall. So morning eventually came, and when we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the lone man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mom exclaim, I ran over to her and watched as she picked something up from the ground beside her tent. She held it between us, staring at it, not speaking. It was a metal hanger. I live in Switzerland at the foot of the Jura Mountains. The name Jacques comes from the Celtic word for forest, which is fitting considering almost the entirety of the mountain range is covered in woods and pastures. Unlike the nearby Alps, for example, due to altitude, it has a rich history of legends and spirituality, preferably due to the variety of cultures that have inhabited the region throughout history, Celts, Romans, etc. Now, I must emphasize that this story is more on the side of an interesting and creepy encounter than really anything scarier or threatening directly, at least in my view. Growing up, I just saw the Jura as a cool place to explore and admire, going camping and hiking. As I got older, I realized that there was a certain spiritual element to the region, whether that be as mundane as the abundance of churches to monasteries from the 12th century or more small-scale and personal manifestations of spirituality, which is what I want to touch on today. A few years ago, during bike rides or hikes, I started seeing things like fabrics hung in trees and man-made rock formations. I didn't really think much of it, since I assumed it was kids or maybe scout activities. However, as I paid more attention, I realized that these things had more meaning behind them than I had initially thought. Large spiral rock formations at mountain peaks, stone patterns connected trees in a wheel shape in the middle of the woods, pebble markings in the shape of symbols, runes, old world letters, markings on the trees. This is a little striking, admittedly, and a little creepy, considering how foreign and unusual it seemed to me. Later on, I understood more clearly what this was, or at least what some of it was. I started seeing remains of what I now know to be sweat lodges. I don't claim to be very knowledgeable on this, but these appear to be related to the general field of spirituality and shamanism, perhaps of Native American origin. Eventually, I saw a couple of these ceremonies in the act. The way I did was that during bike rides, I would see either a few cars with feather dreamcatcher bead rearview mirror decorations parked seemingly in the middle of nowhere, or see fabrics tied to trees by the road, and then hear noises further up in the woods. I'm curious, so I had to investigate. The first time I saw a group of people building a sweat lodge, collecting wood, it seemed as though they made a makeshift bed nearby where a couple of people would take naps and rotate. I'm assuming so they'd be less tired for the nighttime ceremony. I didn't want to bother them, so I kept a certain distance. But eventually, I ran into one of them collecting wood. I greeted him normally in French, and he quietly and politely did the same. He didn't look or sound like a native Swiss, whereas the rest of the group did from a distance. So I'd always just assumed that he was maybe their guide or something. Also considering he was wearing these sort of stereotypical baggy maroon clothes. The second time, I'm not sure if it was the same people, but it was a similar sight in a different place. The part that bothered me a bit was that there were a few young kids with them. For those who don't know about sweat lodge ceremonies at all, they're quite intense and can be unsafe for adults, let alone small children. The ceremony involves making a hut with a pit inside and a fire pit outside of it. Basically, they put large stones on the exterior fire, keep them up as much as possible, then transport them to the indoor pit, and then I guess throw water on it, and create intense steam. This includes tobacco baggies and herbs, as well as, I believe, sometimes some form of drugs. Whether or not they were drugs, the heat and steam have led to deaths, and is a draining experience, and I hope that the kids weren't there for that. The day after, I checked on the place and walked around the structure out of interest. There was lots of interesting stuff like tobacco baggies hanging from the structure, rock formations creating unknown symbols, markings on trees, and creepiest of all, a fairly large piece of bone about the size of a fist balanced on a tree stump. So, I won't quite say this was a terrifying experience yet, but it was certainly a fascinating, if not unsettling, encounter and a new aspect of the area that I simply wasn't aware of before. The story happened to my father. I was only recently told this story for the first time after my dad was looking for a tent that he borrowed a couple of years ago, and I had to admit it was burnt down during a drunken escapade at a local river. A whole different story in and of itself. But still, to the saving when my dad was 16. All the way back in 1976, him and my uncle Nigel were very outgoing and liked to explore to keep themselves occupied. In the summer of '76 came around, and my dad finished school. He wanted to do one big bit of adventuring before he began work. The Pennine Way, for those who don't know, is a 270-mile walkway in Britain that, depending on which way you walk, starts just in the south of Scotland and basically cuts to the middle of England and finishes in the Midlands. It usually takes roughly around 3 to 4 weeks to walk. So, with a long summer to fill, my dad, 15-year-old Uncle Nigel, and my dad's friend Russ were dropped off in Scotland by my great-grandfather to begin their hike. The first week went swimmingly. They met some nice locals who even cooked them food and gave them a room to sleep in, and generally enjoyed this whole new level of freedom and trust upon them. They mainly camped in clear areas, but one day they decided to cover an extra 5 miles in order to reach a village, as they needed to buy some more food and get spare tent pegs. They stumbled into a village around 6:00 p.m. and saw that the local pub was opening. After relaxing in the pub with some drinks, my dad tells me that the owner probably knew they were underage, but when did all the business they can get. The owner offered to let the guys camp out in the backfield of their pub. The landlady and wife of said owner seemed oddly hesitant at first, looking a bit concerned and having a bit of a word with her husband in private. However, Yorkshire hospitality seemed to override any doubts she had, and after a night of heavy drinking with the locals, they retired to their tent. My dad says that they were using an oil lantern hooked to the center of the tent as a light source, and when they turned it off, they left it hanging, which is important not only for what happened next, but also what happened the next day. My dad woke up and turned on the oil light while debating to get up and have a wee in the field, seeing as the owners had been nice letting them camp out. When he heard a door creak open and creak shut, there were no footsteps, so my dad had to put it down to an old shed door or something. After a few seconds, however, the sound of feet landing on grass became progressively audible until they stopped right outside the tent. My dad thought it was just the owner checking on them. And as he went to unzip the tent, the owner fully unzipped it. My dad said the weird thing about this was that he didn't have on a shirt, just some slippers and night trousers. After my dad asked what he was doing, he started out some excuse about hearing a growl and wanted to check on the boys to see if they were okay and safe before looking around. There was no growl, as the only sound in the last 5 minutes was the door, the footsteps, and the unzipping of the tent. The guy weirdly emphasized the need for a good sleep before hiking and intrusively tapped the oil light, asking it to be turned off. He walked off, letting out a frustrated sigh when nearing the house, and closed the door behind him. Morning comes, and the owner's wife makes the boys some breakfast while they pack up their stuff. The owner takes down the tent for them and takes off somewhere in his 4x4 without coming back in the house. They thank the woman and tell her to thank her husband. She says she will when she figures out when he comes back, as he left early that morning. They come to the designated camping spot just next to a small stream around an hour and a half early and decide to have a longer rest after walking about 130 to 140 miles over the last 8 to 9 days. They pull out the tent and find lots of small holes, all about a pen's width wide. That's how my dad described the size as he was holding a pen while telling me this. Everyone looks confused, and my dad rationalizes this by the man telling him about an animal last night. It must have come back and nibbled on the tent. Whatever it was, he explained to the guys. Russ suggests they walked back to a different village around 2 miles back to try to get another tent. They leave the now useless tent as a marker for their sights and walked back to the village. To their luck, a shop clearly targeting walkers is open. Unfortunately, they didn't have any tents, but they decide to buy tape and cover the holes for its night and hope to find a new tent somewhere soon. When walking back, the sun begins to set, and it was quite dark. Moonlight mainly guided them back down the path. When they returned to the site, they couldn't believe it. Their tent was set up for them, but on fire, completely engulfed in flames. They threw water and their bottles over the tent and used the stream water to fill them and eventually douse the flame. When they looked inside the tent, their oil lamp glass had been smashed. Someone had followed them, set up their tent, and waited for them to return before smashing the oil lamp, and in turn, lighting up the tent in flames. My dad told me there really isn't an explanation except for the pub owner. He was stopped doing whatever he was planning on doing by my dad being awake and decided to take some messed up form of revenge by sending a message. At first, I totally didn't believe my dad and thought he was trying to scare me. But upon referencing the burning tent incident in a phone call to Uncle Nigel, he instantly started rambling about how weird it was, and my Uncle Nigel doesn't lie. A couple of years ago, I went hiking alone on different trails in the Blue Ridge Parkway. For some reason, I thought it would be okay for a 20-something woman to go alone. Stupid, I know. I always wanted to visit Mount Mitchell, so I made the trek up there. Since it wasn't a Monday, there weren't a ton of visitors. The path to the summit is paved, so it's a fairly easy walk, but it's a bit steep. I was a smoker at the time, so I was quite out of breath. I finally got to the top and stood to the side, trying to catch my breath, and I see someone step very close to me out of the corner of my eye. I look up, and it's a man, probably in his late 40s, with greasy dark brown hair. He says, "Hey, I noticed you took a while to get up here, and you're breathing really hard. Are you okay?" I was kind of taken aback, but I replied, saying I was fine, that I'm a smoker, and I kind of laughed to make light of the situation. He stood there, looking at me, so I made a little nod to let him know I was going to walk away. I walked over to a podium that showed you the direction you're looking and what mountains and cities are that way in the distance. He followed me. He started talking out of nowhere about how he had recently been divorced and was part of a men's group that traveled around the country to lots of famous tourist spots. He asked where I was from, and I told him. He proceeded to tell me really intimate details as to why he got divorced. He told me how he suspected his wife was cheating on him, so he hid in the closet one night and caught her and a coworker in bed together. He grumbled they both paid dearly for that night. I tried to make it visibly obvious that I was uncomfortable, but he kept talking and asking me questions without pausing to let me answer. I came to the conclusion that he was simply lonely and wanted someone to talk to. Then I realized there was no one with him this entire time, and I hadn't noticed any men's group. But maybe they split up and went their separate ways for a while, I thought. At any rate, I became increasingly nervous, so I let him know I was going to head back down to the gift shop. Again, he started following me. There are lots of trails that branch off from the main path to the summit, but I wasn't interested in going on any of those since I was still so out of breath. I wasn't walking with the man now, but he was following me. He called out to me loudly, "Hey." I turned around, and he was grinning from ear to ear. His hair somehow looked even greasier. He says, "Why don't we go walking on one of these trails? I could show you a really good time." I replied, "No, thank you," sternly. I looked to my left, and there were two elderly women sitting on a bench. I realized they had been watching us. One of the women called to the man, "I think it's time the young lady gets going now." I gave her a soft smile and nod. I turned around and walked at a brisk pace down the path, passing the gift shop, going straight to my car. The man hadn't followed me. That was my last hike of the day, and I'm glad that nothing worse happened while I was alone. I definitely don't go on outings like that by myself anymore.